This is the Project Management Podcast. We bring project management topics to beginners and experts. Find us on the web at www.thepmpodcast.com or send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com.
Hello and welcome to this premium episode number 119. I am Cornelius Fichtner. This is the Project Management Podcast for the 21st of May 2009. Nice to have you with us. This episode of the Project Management Podcast is, as always, a premium episode recorded especially for you, the premium subscribers of our podcast. And thank you so much for supporting my efforts to improve project management by bringing you all these great discussions with experts from our profession. In this episode, we are welcoming back Dux Raymond Tsai to talk about the PMIS, the Project Management Information System. We talk about what it is in general, why it's important for project management, and how to set one up following his recommendations of the book SharePoint for Project Management. But as in our last discussion with Dux, we really focus more on the general concepts behind the PMIS and what best practices to employ. Don't forget, we are continuing the giveaway for his book, SharePoint for Project Management. You are automatically entered into the drawing and you could win one copy. If you would like to increase your chances, then just go ahead and send an email to pmpodcast@gmail.com with the subject SharePoint. And now, enjoy the interview. Hey Dux, welcome back to the program.
Hey Cornelius, thank you for having me back.
In the last episode, we spoke about your book, SharePoint for Project Management. And one concept that you use in the first part of the book is the PMIS. So I'd like to focus on that PMIS here today in this interview. What is a PMIS, generally speaking?
Great question. PMIS stands for Project Management Information System. Now, I want to do a pop quiz here. You have your PMP, right, Cornelius?
Yes.
Remember when you were studying for the exam?
Yes.
The 44 processes. You had to memorize the inputs, tools, and outputs.
Absolutely.
If you can remember, in the tools, somehow this acronym always pops up. PMIS. PMIS, right? And it's funny when I talk to people about it, I go, all right, what's a PMIS then? It's kind of sort of like Microsoft Project, I guess?
No.
Kind of, sort of. Well, it's interesting because PMIS, as defined by the PMBOK guide, I'll just summarize the definition. It's essentially the tie that binds everything together in a project environment. So the idea of a PMIS, it's a system that will assist project managers, and it will essentially it's going to do a couple of things. Pretty much, it's going to help the project manager store project artifacts, help the project manager with project communication, and help the project manager automate a lot of the project processes. Now, one thing that's missing today, a lot of PMs rely on tools like Microsoft Project or Excel or some other sophisticated tools, but the problem is it's all disjointed. A good example is you as a PM, for example, you might use email to send an email to your customer or your resource, but then you might take that same information and put it in some other system or in Excel or Microsoft Project. So there's all these redundancies. The idea with a PMIS is this would be something that would know everything you do around the project, so who you need to communicate with, what update you put in for a specific task, or what status you reported on last week, and automate a lot of these where you don't have to do it twice or three times. And then second, a PMIS should allow you to automate processes. It could be as simple as expense reimbursement. It could be automating change control. I talked about that in the last interview. So the PMIS would be this central system that will tie all these pieces together. So I'm not saying you're going to get rid of email or Microsoft Project or Excel. You're still going to take advantage of those, but you use them much more effectively because you have this PMIS that can support all these other pieces as you use it within your project.
Okay, and when we now take the PMIS and we look at it in conjunction with SharePoint, what is a PMIS when we use SharePoint to manage our projects?
Okay, specifically with SharePoint, a PMIS, first of all, is a SharePoint site or a SharePoint website.
Okay.
And the beauty of a SharePoint website, I'm not saying it's the only game in town, but the beauty with a SharePoint website, since it's a Microsoft-based product, almost a lot of organizations I work with is using Microsoft tools. So it has a nice tie-in with Microsoft-based tools. For example, let me give you an example. Dates, schedules are very important in any project environment. I can have a calendar in the SharePoint website or SharePoint PMIS. So I can put in on my the team status meetings. I can put in who's off, who's available. But the beauty of this is this calendar on this website can be synchronized with Outlook. Now, how many websites have you seen talks to an Outlook calendar automatically? That addresses a key inefficiency, where before it was just some regular website. I would have to put the date in the website and I would have to put the date in Outlook. But now it just syncs it. There's a way to sync it. Another example is I can have information in Excel sitting on my computer, not in any special place. Let's say I have a spreadsheet on budget, and I can tie that information to the website, the SharePoint PMIS, and have my resources put in some budgetary information on the website, and voila, it can synchronize back to my Excel spreadsheet. And again, that's just brilliant, right? So I can have information, synchronize information in a single location, again, without all these redundancies and inefficiencies.
Okay, so we talked about, or you'd rather talked about, you could put a calendar in, you can have Excel items in there. What project components do you recommend for a PMIS in SharePoint?
Very good question. SharePoint out of the box comes with a lot of what's called site templates. So you can use these just like a template in Word. You have a brochure template. You can get started and create a brochure. So the same idea in SharePoint, it comes with a bunch of site templates so you can get your site up and running and start building and using your PMIS. So what critical components do you need? Well, first of all, I would say a document library. This is a repository that you can put in physical project artifacts or documents, things like Word documents, your project charter, perhaps your requirements document, Excel files, maybe for budget, even Microsoft project files you can put it in a library, a PowerPoint file. So you'll need a document library. That's very important. Another component of your PMIS that I highly suggest you should have is a calendar. And again, this is a centralized calendar for the project that people can use and take advantage of. And if you have Outlook, you can synchronize with Outlook. Contacts, perhaps, for your key stakeholders and vendors and partners you work with. And you might want to put in there what's called a risk list, so you can track your risk and monitor which one took place, which one didn't. If you need to trigger a contingency plan. A project task list, so you can have your very simplistic Gantt chart up there. And then you can create custom lists also for your resource pool, for example. Or you can use web parts to build charts and dashboards. So a lot of these components you can put in and again, I can't stress this hard enough, but the idea of SharePoint is it can empower you as a project manager regardless of your technical expertise, because with SharePoint, no programming needed.
Okay.
Just like how you're comfortable with using Office, it's very similar. You got to learn the basics of SharePoint, but no programming needed.
Mm-hmm. It sounds a bit overwhelming with all these various templates and widgets that I can put into my PMIS suddenly. So, two-part question here. How much planning is required to do this right? And are there any particular decisions that I have to make in regards to what to include and what not to include?
Absolutely. You raise a great point because as I've engaged with different organizations, one of the biggest mistake you'll do is take the out-of-the-box template and assume that one size would fit all. And you said overwhelming. I've seen it where organizations or project teams use out-of-the-box site templates. It has a bunch of great components, but some of it is not relevant. And now it's going to throw people off. Okay, what do I use this for? So to minimize that, the key is you got to sit down and think about, okay, in my project environment, what are the critical things, and when I say things, critical areas of my project that I need to capture and, more importantly, address. So let's say, well, I need to make sure all my project artifacts is kept track, all the versions. So with that being said, then you'll need your document library to have version history turned on. And normally this is true if you're in a very highly regulated environment, like if you need to comply with SOX auditing standards or HIPAA auditing standards, those kind of things. And then you go through the process too of understanding, okay, who's involved? And more importantly, what information do they need? The last thing you want, again, is to have a lot of information and present it to everybody. And let's say the customer couldn't care less about the minutiae, the little details or the little tasks that your resource is working on. So in short, having a proper project communications plan is important. So you can map and identify who needs what type of information. And lastly, you have to think about too the type of your organization and environment as to how you define your project site or project or your PMIS, because ideally your organization should have what's called a SharePoint governance plan identifying how these sites should be created, where it should be created, who can create it. For example, how would you want to group your sites? Is it based on portfolio, program? So all that discussion has to happen first before you start using it.
And what happens if I set this up wrong at the beginning? How bad is this for me down the road, for my ability to manage projects with SharePoint?
It's not going to be a disaster or a catastrophe, but just like everything else, every project manager would know, even using such a tool like SharePoint, planning is critical. Mm-hmm. I mean, you don't just decide one day, oh, I'm going to use SharePoint here. SharePoint's here. Go and prosper. You don't decide to build a house by buying a plot of land and go to Home Depot and start buying, plywood and hammer and start building your house or project PM or your PMIS.
You don't know my house.
So the key is really just like sound planning or sound project management. If you're using a new tool such as SharePoint, you got to step back and really assess and analyze where you are now. Okay, now we're using Excel and email. That's all we do. And then where you want to move forward. And how you figure that out is look at all the deficiencies and pain points that you have and map it to how SharePoint can help you.
And once again, I hear the theme from our last interview shine through this here. The processes are important. SharePoint is really just the tool that enables you to translate what you do in regards to project management and help you efficiently and effectively put that into an environment that your team is able to use online, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, it's a great tool, don't get me wrong, but I cannot stress the importance of, for anything you do, be it a project environment, you're using a tool like SharePoint, there's three things to it. It's having a sound process, having the right mix of people and getting them on board, and then having the technology in place. Do not look at the technology as the be-all, end-all.
Mm. One thing that I found interesting in your book is when I looked at the PMIS, you have a whole chapter just about adding stakeholders into the PMIS in SharePoint. Why this particular focus on just one activity of adding a stakeholder into the PMIS?
One of the great things with SharePoint, and which has been a thorny issue traditionally, is granting access to individuals to come to your project site or your PMIS.
Yes.
Before SharePoint, we had to rely on IT to do that. With SharePoint, you as a PM, in theory, could define it yourselves. Now, it's a double-edged sword. It's a great thing, you can do it yourself, but it's a bad thing too, because if you start aimlessly adding people and defining their privilege, it's kind of hard, especially if you're managing a bunch of projects, ergo you have a bunch of PMISs. It's kind of hard to keep track of who can do what where. And that problem won't be as evident as maybe 6 months down the road. And then you'll start having issues where, oh, I didn't know you had access to that. So that whole chapter when I talked about adding stakeholders to your PMIS, It's again back to the basics. I talk about having a project communications plan. You got to figure out who your stakeholders are. For example, you identify your customer. Okay, what kind of information would the customer need? Well, the customer would like to know if a milestone has been met. The customer would like this information on a weekly basis. The customer would like this information be emailed or be sent to him or her. So that alone is critical, because now knowing that, you can tweak SharePoint to behave that way. And maybe your resource, your engineer or your programmer, all they care about is looking at their task or information that's relevant to them. So you can tweak the PMIS to present that. And last thing you want to do is, like what you said, Cornelius, you do not want to overwhelm your stakeholder when they come in. They got all these things, all these buttons they can press. You got to make it relevant to them. You got to make it so that it's a tool that helps them and not another tool that serves as a burden to them.
Mm-hmm. How about if we're talking about using the SharePoint as a PMIS in a consulting environment where I'm a consulting company and all of my customers are external to my network? I assume it's possible to grant access to external networks from outside of my network, right?
Absolutely. Out of the box, if you install SharePoint, the way authentication or granting access works is it needs the user to have a Windows-based account within your environment. Now, The beauty with SharePoint is it provides other options. I can go into technical details, but just to give you examples, it has a technology called form-based authentication, which doesn't require you to have a Windows account. You can still come in. It has, if you go online, there's a site called Codeplex. It's essentially a repository of add-ins to Microsoft product, one of which is SharePoint. There's people out there who developed a way to use your OpenID credentials to log into SharePoint. And what OpenID is, it's an industry standard credential, like having a Yahoo account. You can log into SharePoint. So to answer your question, no, you're not limited to use SharePoint within a enterprise environment. In fact, that's the beauty of it. In theory, I can log into SharePoint with my Windows account, and a customer externally can log in with whatever credential that's acceptable to SharePoint. And SharePoint accepts, if I'm not mistaken, to date about 4 or 5 different ways of credentialing mechanism.
All right. To close out our interview today, let's take a step back from the technology and let's take a look at this from the angle of the project manager who would now like to get started on this. What would you tell them? What should be their first 2 or 3 steps, and what pitfalls do they need to look out for?
Okay, very good. So if you're thinking of using SharePoint as a project management information system, obviously you got to have a SharePoint environment. In my book, I spec'd out that the best way to find out if you're not sure, go talk to your IT folks and ask them, do we have SharePoint in place? If you're a Microsoft environment, if your organization is a Microsoft environment, most likely you do. The second step is find out what kind of access you have. To get started, to build your PMIS, you would have to have at least what's called contribute privilege in SharePoint. And once you have contribute privilege, you're able to create your own PMIS and get started with it with a site template. Pitfalls, again, don't get too caught up too focused on the technology. The way you look at this or take advantage of this is step back and think about, okay, in my project environment today, what are some of my pain points? For example, well, docs, I have a hard time capturing change requests. That's a pain point. I have a hard time capturing lessons learned. That's a pain point. So document all these pain points and then go back now and look at this tool and see where it can help you with those pain points. And with that, you should be good to go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time again today, Docs. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And that was our interview with Dux Raymond Tsai on the PMIS from his book SharePoint for Project Management. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at thepmpodcast.com. If you're a PM who wants to become a PMP, then the easiest way to do so is with our sister podcast, the Project Management Prepcast, and study for the exam by watching over 100 video episodes from pmprepcast.com. If you are already a PMP, then stop by at pmlectures.com. Here we go beyond just delivering PDUs. We give you exclusive training from the brightest minds in project management today. Please send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com, and when you write, yes, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. Avoid the temptation to perfect everything. That's what the next generation of your product or service is all about. Until next time. This is the Project Management Podcast for the 21st of May 2009. Nice to have you with you. Nice to have you with you? Funny.